Okay, hello. My name is Caitlin Mandeville. I'm a PhD candidate at NTNU here, working with Anders and Ireland, who you've heard from already. I guess I'm closing out this first session, talking about some of the same themes as the other speakers have so far, but kind of turning and trying to take the perspective of data users, researchers who are working with different kinds of data. Let's see if I can get rid of that. Yeah, so we're going to do this by sort of taking the perspective of one specific data type, presence-only data, and using that as a case study to look at some different trends in reproducibility and openness of studies that use biodiversity data as a whole. And I should say most of what I'm going to be presenting today comes from a paper that's in review right now, and the three co-authors I have on that paper have already talked to you today. That's Wouter Cook and Anders Winstad and Arlen Nielsen. Yeah, so what we did here, this work kind of arose from a systematic review where we tried to comprehensively look at any and all peer-reviewed English language articles that were sort of connected by one common thread, this use of presence-only biodiversity data. And by that I mean point occurrences of a species or organism observation that have just these two key elements, the taxon identification and the location. No absence data. So our interest in this topic actually didn't really initially arise from looking at open data as much as it did from this top left element, citizen science. So most of my research right now has to do with opportunistic citizen science data. And as you've heard already, that's one of the major sources of presence-only data and open data, along with historical data that's being digitized. So commonly, these data sources in recent years have been digitized and uploaded and shared in these open online data platforms, with GBIF being a major example of that. And that has sort of facilitated this massive growth in the analysis of presence-only data. Of course, that's not the only data type shared in platforms like these, but it is kind of a major one and has been increasing in analysis lately. So we started sort of looking at this question from that angle, and we began to think, are there other sources of presence-only data that aren't being talked about as much? Are they also being shared openly, or where are they applied? That kind of led us into this question. Presence-only data is also interesting because it comes with all these challenges for analysis, and there's a lot of ongoing innovation right now in the best approaches for working with this data type, including a lot of research by colleagues here at NTNU and elsewhere in Norway. So we were sort of interested in seeing what analysis approaches researchers on the ground are actually using. And then finally, and what I'm going to mostly focus on today, presence-only data is pretty interesting also from this open science perspective. So it's probably one of the most straightforward types of data to share with existing infrastructures and best practices, and maybe the most talked about in terms of sharing. So we were interested in sort of using it to test how consistently some of these open data practices are being applied in the literature as a whole. Yeah, so really briefly, we retrieved just under 3,700 articles from the Web of Science. And we searched for them, targeting all abstracts whose text contained both one of about 30 terms related to the presence-only nature of data, and one of 5 terms related to biodiversity. So we retrieved these articles, we screened their abstracts, and we retained just under 2,000 articles. Then on that full data set, we did some bibliometric analyses and some topic modeling to kind of get a sense of broad trends in the literature. And then we also took this subset of 300 articles, which we then read in full and collected some characteristics, especially some characteristics sort of relating to their openness. So I'll present some of our results. Really broadly, we saw, as expected, that the application of presence-only data is increasing really dramatically, especially over the past 15 or so years. And by breaking the full data set down into these topic categories, we could see that the nature of publications using this data type have kind of been shifting. Initially, the growth was primarily led by this blue color methodological papers. And then you can see right around 2015, the increase in method papers sort of flattened off, and the growth has really been driven since then by applied papers and data papers. And we see similar trends in citations with that shift happening sort of right around the same time. We're kind of interested to see and maybe speculate with this lower relative citation rate of methodological papers more recently, whether it's possible that might imply that applied researchers are sort of still more often citing older methods papers, and maybe newer methods aren't catching on quite as quickly, or whether there's some other trends going on there. But then broadly speaking, who are these academic users, these researchers writing papers using presence-only data? Well, one of the first things we saw that it's a really large and decentralized group of researchers. In the 2000 papers that we looked at, there were well over 7,000 distinct authors in nearly 500 distinct journals. So very spread out. And the average author contribution was relatively low, so we're guessing that these are mostly authors who don't only work with presence-only data, but who just sometimes incorporate it into their broader research. Just a small number of highly cited articles. And the distribution is global, but unevenly distributed, which sort of maps up with the figures that we saw in previous talks today. That distribution is really centered in Europe and North America right now. Yeah, so this is kind of the big picture that we came away with of what this pool of authors working with this type of data looks like. Broad, decentralized, and growing quickly. So then to get sort of a closer look at the practices that these researchers are actually sort of engaging with, working with this data in the literature, we turn to that 300 paper subset that we actually read in full and collected data from. So one of the first things we looked at, showing the results of here, is where researchers were accessing their presence-only data from. And right off the bat, we sort of expected that a lot of this would be from open databases. It turns out that that is the most common source of presence-only data, but it's far from the majority. What you see in this histogram here is, of course, the various sources that data was accessed from by the papers in our review. And I should point out that it's not mutually exclusive. Some papers access data from multiple sources, and that's reflected here. So yeah, you can see that open databases represent about 43% of the papers. But there were a lot of other sources that papers accessed this presence-only data from. Next down the list, you see original data collected by the paper authors, the literature, museums, and so on. So then the next question that we kind of asked ourselves was, so researchers who are publishing these data from other sources, are they then making those data open? Is this generating new open presence data that other researchers can use? And by and large, we found that this was not the case. We are looking here at all of the sources of data that we just looked at on the previous slide. And for each article that accessed some data from one of these sources, what percentage of those articles took different publishing practices with the data? The dark blue color represents data that was published using fair data principles. As you can see, that's really in the minority. The medium shade represents data that was published in a more limited way, like, for example, in the appendix of a paper. And then the light shade is data that weren't published at all. So I guess a lot of work to do in this area. It's interesting to me that these numbers are quite a bit lower than what we just saw from some previous studies. Maybe that has to do with the journals that were included, a really wide range of journals, rather than focusing on a few more well-known journals. But an interesting trend. So then one of the next things we considered was sort of the metadata that the papers described of the data sets they were working with. And in this kind of topic, we really focused in on the structure or original sampling design of the data. It's an interesting question because when papers describe to a greater extent the sampling design, it can open up more doors for different analysis approaches. It's often thought the presence-only data sort of go hand in hand with being opportunistically collected, but it's not always the case. That can be collected in a structured way, and we wondered how common that was. So, as you can see, opportunistic data is of papers that do report that sampling design is the most common, but there's also quite a bit of semi-structured and even quite heavily structured data that's being analyzed in a presence-only framework. And perhaps not surprisingly, there's also quite a bit of papers that did not describe that data structure at all. And that distribution of reporting structure was pretty evenly distributed throughout those different original data sources. Interestingly, and just kind of as a side note, we were interested to see that even pretty simple elements of the presence-only data were not always reported by the articles, like in the example of sample size right here. Yeah, so getting back to a discussion of structure, we didn't see as much of a difference in analysis approach the articles taken, driven by the different data structures as we might have expected. More structured data does correlate with more inferential analysis approaches as opposed to summary statistics or sort of just reports of data, but it's not such an extreme correlation. And opportunistic data actually has a pretty high proportion of articles that were engaged in some sort of rarer inferential analysis approaches, possibly because there's so much innovation going on right now focused on opportunistic data. And this is just kind of an overview of overall the different types of analysis approaches that we saw in this data set. You can see that species distribution modeling is definitely dominant, but there's really a wide range of approaches that were taken. So yeah, that's kind of the landscape, the big picture idea of what we saw when we were looking at this presence-only data set. We really were sort of surprised by some of the findings with regards to the openness of the data that we were looking at. One of the major conclusions that we came away with was that there's not such a tight relationship between presence-only data and open data as we might have expected. And we wanted to kind of dig in from a user perspective to see why that might be, and why some of these data maybe aren't being shared as much as we thought they might be. So to do that, we subset our data into these 3 different categories to kind of look at a profile of 3 different users of presence-only data, defined by where they accessed that data from. Users who access data from open sources, those who only use their original data, and those who used what I'll call found data, which is data that they didn't collect themselves or get from an open source, but maybe from a management agency or a nonprofit or the literature. So I'll just walk through some key facts about each of these different profiles really quickly, and then sort of try to draw some overall conclusions. Looking first at users who collected data from an open online platform, that's 43% of all the papers we looked at, we see that just over half combine their open data with data from other sources. So I'll have a little ticker going here, kind of compiling the information that we're picking up. That's the first piece of information. We were surprised next to see the great variety of different open data sources that these open data users accessed. In the about 130 articles we reviewed that used some open data, they accessed it from 120 different sources, so very diverse. We called 8 of these large databases, basically meaning that they covered data from a very wide spatial extent or very big taxonomic scope, or both. And 57% of open data users accessed a large database. The rest we considered small, and actually a slightly greater number of open data users actually accessed a small database. Of course, some accessed both. We were interested in this fact because there's research that shows that small databases might not remain as stable into the future, or might not keep up with best practices for data standardization. So it's interesting to us to see what a big role they play in users' access of open data. Most open data users, just over 2/3, use just one open data source per paper. And in general, these studies that accessed open presence-only data, about 60% were small or regional, while the rest were large or global. Looking really briefly at this subset that exclusively used open data, we see that just under half didn't report any structure on the data. And in some cases, that may be because they didn't have or didn't know how to access that information. The bulk of the rest described the data as opportunistic. Turning then to look at this other subset, the 56% of open data users that integrated their open data with non-open data, we hypothesized that this set of users, because of their proven familiarity with open data, might be more likely to then themselves publish the data that they obtain from other sources. We found that that really wasn't the case, kind of surprisingly. Only 24% of these users made their non-open data available after publishing their analyses. So yeah, to quickly sum up our profile of sort of an average open data user of presence-only data, it's great to see that there are many users accessing this data. We were interested to notice that many of them were relying on these sort of smaller data aggregators, and they often don't share their own data, so definitely opportunities for continued discussion and education. Moving along to look quickly at the profile of a user who is sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum, collected their own presence-only data and analyzed it in that framework. A slightly smaller percentage of these made their data available, 19%. On a positive note, the vast majority explicitly described the structure of their data. And nearly all of them were small or regional in scale. On a potentially related note, these studies were almost 4 times as likely to contain themes that explicitly related to conservation interventions and decisions than applications of similar data from open sources. Kind of sums up the profile that we're looking at here. Thinking about reasons that might hold these users back from sharing their data, certainly many of the discussions that we've heard earlier today could apply here. It's quite possible, sort of thinking back to Anders' talk, that because some of these data do tend to be semi-structured, it may feel like more of a barrier to these researchers to share them. Or especially if the data have already served some clear and explicit purpose, specifically being tied to local conservation outcomes, the researchers just might not have the motivation or time to take it further and then share those data. It's hard to know, of course, exactly what the reason is from this data that we have here, but it's clear that this is a pool of data users that's producing quite a lot of data with the potential to be shared. And then finally, we'll quickly go through this profile of users who access what we're calling found data. In many ways, their profile is very similar to users that are collecting their own data. About 18% are sharing that data. Tends to be, for the most part, small or regional in scale. And again, more likely to be related to sort of direct conservation outcomes. The major difference here is that fewer of these authors are explicitly describing the structure of their data. And given that this is data that they've accessed from other sources, it's very possible that in many cases this is because they just don't have that information. So we can speculate that possibly that lack of complete knowledge of the data's original structure or sampling design may in some cases hold them back from sharing this data, along with issues of possibly not knowing where they stand with data ownership, given that they haven't collected it themselves, and all the other issues that we've discussed already today. But again, a major source of data that these data users are going to quite a bit of effort to collect and compile from non-open sources, and would be very valuable, of course, to be openly shared. So, the main takeaways that we see here in terms of open data, the good news, of course, is that 43% of present-only data users are looking to open data. So that's a very positive thing. Not all of them are yet practicing best practices for data sharing, and many of them are relying on databases that may not be as reliable into the future. Additionally, a great deal of presence-only data are going unshared, so this represents a really great potential moving forward. In particular, studies with direct conservation applications or smaller studies tend to be negatively correlated with data sharing. So, on the flip side, this means that this is a great audience for continuing to normalize the sharing of ecological data. And we expect to see that as interest in presence-only data continues to increase, researchers are just going to keep using this data more and more, And this really represents a great opportunity for continuing to normalize data sharing among that audience and with this type of data. So that's all I've got. Thanks again to the co-authors and to you all for listening. Thanks.